Okay, so I'm here and I'm making another video about Game of Thrones and astrology. And I, at some point, I think I'm gonna give up talking about Game of Thrones and just talk about astrology. And but before I do that, I just feel like I have these ideas that I've started that I haven't finished. I haven't completed what I wanted to do with them, and there's some ideas that I still haven't brought in that I want to bring in. And one of these things that I feel is important to mention is that there is this guy named Lon Milo Duquette who is I guess he's mainly associated with Crowley and the Thelema stuff, but when it comes to tarot cards, I usually either use the Rider Waite Smith deck or I use the Aleister Crowley Thoth deck, and that I know that say what you will about Aleister Crowley, that the tarot deck that he put together is one of the most famous and popular tarot decks, and even people who are tend to be critical about Crowley generally will admit that the tarot deck is quite a nice work of art and as a classic tarot deck that's comes highly recommended and all this kind of stuff. So I mean, and you don't have to be. I mean, maybe this all fits in together with the conversation. But so, from the angle of Thoth Tarot and Crowley and Lon Milo Duquette, I, at some point in time, was trying to understand the Thoth Tarot or Tarot in general a bit better. And you run into all this stuff about Kabbalah. And while it's entirely possible I may have some genetic Jewish stuff in my blood somewhere from some Eastern European bloodline or whatever. I don't, don't really have much experience or whatever with that, but aside from what Lon Milo Duquette is talking about in this video, so I have to say I'm putting it on him. I'm not no Kabbalah expert here, right? So take it easy on me. But I was basically just rewatching one of his videos, and there was a specific point where he was talking about the subdivisions of the Hebrew alphabet into the numbers 3, 7, and 12, and that there's something going on in Game of Thrones that is very similar. Well, I mean, but first of all, if we talk about the whatever, like the 3, 7, 12 things, I don't really know much about Kabbalah, but I can see that, like, I made a video recently that about the three weird sisters, right? And then if you can see in Game of Thrones, they have the seven as a one of the religions they come up with is the seven. So then seven's a lucky number, and then if you're an astrologer, seven is highly loaded because you've got the seven traditional planets, of which the last one is Saturn, and then they do this mother maiden crone thing with Game of Thrones, and then the seven has as a death planet as the last one. I'm pretty sure if I'm getting this correct, right? So there's obviously the seven to me in Game of Thrones feels like it's a reference to astrology, and then they don't really say much about 12 in Game of Thrones, from what I can tell. But I was rewatching. The point of bringing up Lon Milo Duquette is that I was watching his video, and he was talking about when you go from 3 and you go to 7 and then you go to 12. When you go to 12, that 12 takes on the quality of rivalry and squabbling and battles and sort of like this animal quality of fighting with each other. And he actually says in his video it's like Game of Thrones, and I'm like, oh my god, that's probably because I remember watching this is the second time I watched this video, and I'm like, I probably just literally remembered that idea from Lon Milo Duquette. And then as I've been approaching my astrology, I've been kind of looking at zodiac signs in a way that's kind of like Game of Thrones because of this teaching. And then Lon Milo Duquette in his video goes on to talk about the associating the certain tarot cards with the zodiac wheel and stuff like that. And the 12, the pattern of the 12 have this quality of being very Games of Thrones like. And then I went and made this video about the 12 signs of Game of Thrones, and then I'm just kind of realizing that the Lon Milo Duquette thing is a background influence very much for that idea. So I'm kind of crediting Lon Milo Duquette and also showing my work in that this kind of relates to a Kabbalistic idea, although I have to also admit that I am a never had any formal I have never had any formal experience with Judaism, right? I'm just, doing my own kind of studies and stuff like that. But there's what I wanted to talk about with this video though in Game of Thrones and the 12 signs of astrology and this idea that the 12 signs of astrology are like Game of Thrones, which is an idea that comes from Lon Milo Duquette. Is that in looking at why Game of Thrones is important and relevant to the practice of astrology. So that is kind of like my first point, is this sort of thing about the 12 signs and the initial drama and conflict that comes from the 12 signs. And if you go on online astrology Facebook groups, I think it's kind of funny actually to look for the ones that are kind of trashy or the obvious shit posting groups or the meme groups, or there's often this kind of attitude where people will like, I don't know, I don't want to say give it a bad rap or whatever, because I don't know, the astrology community is what it is, and I don't want to say anything like overly negative about it, but there's a certain side of it with people expressing this thing that is like, a grudge against a certain sign, or people will like, for some reason Gemini often gets bullied, or Scorpio is like, there's this, people get very territorial around Scorpio. Like there's people who have Scorpio suns want to own Scorpio all for themselves, and if any other Scorpio placements aren't real Scorpios, they're infringing on their, you can't call yourself a Scorpio. You don't know what it's like. So there's all this kind of like the problem. One of the things I wanted to talk about was that when I look at people who put up, or I don't know, memes going around, who knows what people's actual intentions are, but there's memes that criticize or show resistance to astrology because they don't want it to be like a like astro racism where you're getting discriminated for a certain sign, or the example that I often use is like people will like give an example of somebody's house hunting, and the people were like, oh well, I just don't think that like a Capricorn is the right mix for this house, sorry, and never mind if you have a good job, or if you're, you clean up after yourself, or all the qualities that a roommate should look for, that if you have this thing that you may not even believe, like it may just be this arbitrary thing that people are using to discriminate against you. But even in that example, I'm contrasting something that is a meritocracy for finding housing versus housing or whatever. There's all this politics of like having housing and how you would choose a roommate. And honestly, if you're living with some crazy astrologers, you have to submit yourself to these crazy astrologers and how whatever methods they have for divining whether or not they want to live with you. I don't really think that's really much of an argument to say that it's discrimination against me because of a certain blood. Like, do you understand astrology? Do you understand why they're discriminating? Is it because of like saying, oh, it's just because all these people are in this category, like we're going to be like the Starks and the Lannisters and go to war because we have different, the point isn't to say by bringing up Game of Thrones and astrology and putting people into different camps and stuff like that, that there's this thing where I'm innately just against you because you're the certain sign, and and it's never going to work out, and that's the point of, what's the point of doing Game of Thrones astrology videos anyways, right, is what I wanted to explore. But the thing is, it's like, it's not coming out of like nowhere. It's not coming out of like Lon Milo Duquette saying that like, he's making a tarot deck that like where you can look at the different archetypes and stuff like that, because these archetypes are the ones that are more animalistic and competitive and stuff like this, and squabbly, we're doing this so that we can just embrace it and go and chop each other's heads off and live a ruthless cutthroat. Like, it's not really the point of what I'm trying to say, but rather that if you are aware of it, that you can start to like, what am I trying to say about this? We're talking about fate, right? Let's talk about fate and determinism and free will and stuff like this, right? It's a big kind of transition, of course, but next, well, like, okay, maybe let's put fate and free will on hold. And I'm gonna take a glass of water here. I'm gonna, rather than talking about the problem of fate and free will, I'm gonna talk about another problem. I'm gonna talk about the problem of identity politics. So there's a whole thing about, like, let's say I'm doing astrology, I do natal charts for people, and that if what is a natal chart aside from trying to say something about somebody's identity and who that person is and what they're doing and all this kind of stuff, right? Um, and if you go back to the ancient traditional practice of astrology, they they're not saying just to look at the chart on its own, but they're saying to look at what you know about the person whose chart you're reading for, and then read the chart in that context. So instead of just doing a cold reading, where I've done cold readings where people just give me their chart and I don't know, I kind of just fill in the blanks. And actually, it's not. I don't know. I don't want to brag, but I've done some good cold readings. It's not impossible. But the way the actual tradition is to know who it is you're reading for, in the sense that, let's think about the an ancient or medieval world like Game of Thrones, where you are either born into certain families that are either noble families or they're peasant families or they're wildling families, and what your life is going to be like is to some extent determined by what family you're born into. Now, unfortunately, well, I don't know about unfortunately. Maybe for what it's worth, that is an historical system, and there's the limitations of having your life determined by a certain class system like that, or certain. It's not really like a certain hierarchy, right, that exists. That a progressive society sort of has this ideal of having things more smoothed out in the terms of class mobility, where a person, if they wanted to, if a person was working as a peasant but they were clever, and if they wanted to get an education, that we want to have that in our modern society, there's this idea that there's more doors open, that you can do what you want with your life and you're not just stuck to this deterministic thing, whatever, right? But and that ancient astrology comes out of more of this world where you are very much determined by the family you're born into, right? Now, but the thing is, if you look at the way politics works in modern politics, and you look at, looks at the Prime Minister of Canada, he's Justin Trudeau's son. Look at what happens in America. You've got, two generations of the Bushes. Look at Donald Trump. His father was like a real estate mogul guy, and he just inherited this whole. It's like, if you actually look at the way that modern politics works, it's not really. There's this kind of things of like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, right? Like there's political families, there's political dynasties, there's political power structures, political hierarchies that are connected with family and all this kind of stuff. And like you have the royal family in England, which isn't like the prime minister, and like they made a separation there, but there's still there's something about modern politics which I feel like it's like why people like watching Game of Thrones, why it still feels relevant, is that it still very has some of these similar things going on, or that when we're trying to say, like, if we're talking about, like, if we're talking, oh, so now we bring it back to astrology, or if we're talking about, if you're trying to understand, never mind we're talking about the determination of, like, if you just gave up all the new age stuff and you went into politics and decided to become, like, if I decide, if I wanted to go in this, like, I'm gonna go to university and study Marxism and look at it as a class determinism or whatever, right? Like that class just determines everything, and or something like this, play up that angle or something like that. But then you can, like, balance, you can sort of look at it as like different factors, different influences, different, like, the end result of whatever ends up happening has something where it's like there's all sorts of, like, a biological angle, there's like people, there could be people who have an attitude of genetic determinism, who think that if we understand how genes work, that your whole life is just dictated by your genes and you're just playing out this program where somebody with one gene would behave one way but somebody with another gene would behave a different way, and so based on genetics you can predict people's behaviors and stuff like this. And that when you factor astrology into this, it's like astrology is like an ancient way of people trying to play this game, basically, of trying to make predictions based on these deterministic factors. But astrology isn't, I mean, um, astrology is like, somebody made a post recently about this problem, that it's the real astrologers or whatever. I mean, I'm in agreement with this guy. I take his point of view. It's not about causality necessarily. It's more about reading signs and omens. And I just a whole lot of people. I mean, if you take all the same classes or whatever, they go over this in. If you take a class from Adam Ellenboss, if you take a class from Chris Brennan, if you read Chris Brennan's textbook, if you talk to you read Demetra George, or listen to Robert Schmidt lectures. There's a lot of people talk about that side of things. There's also this whatever Cornelius book. I don't know. I can throw out books and references. There's a lot of people who talk about it. But I'm just thinking that there's, if you look at it a certain way of like the omens and stuff like this that are not like the omens work in a certain way. They're symbols where there's certain symbols that say like represent different like body parts, right? So the symbol isn't there making something happen in your body part. It's there to say, hey, you should pay attention to this thing. That doesn't, it's not like it's something saying, it's a messenger that says, hey, you should pay attention to this, or hey, you should notice that. Isn't the same person who's like making the thing happen, but that there's something at work that at least is connected enough to make the relation, right? There's a relationship, there's a going on between these two separate things that is meaningful, and that a message can get across, basically, right? But anyway, but the whole thing though is that the practice of astrology, going back to what I was trying to say, is that in order to understand what the message getting across means, is that meaning is context dependent, so that the context has to be read within the context of a life that's grounded into everyday reality, if it's going to be relevant to everyday reality and what's going on in everyday reality and that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of place where Game of Thrones I find is interesting. Of course, Game of Thrones is just a TV show, but Game of Thrones is interesting because George R. R. Martin is trying to make a kind of a story that's both fantasy and kind of mythological, but at the same time more realistic. Or that isn't. Like, he was saying that the problem with J.R.R. Tolkien is that you have the orcs representing like kind of a pure evil, and that the people fighting the orcs are generally purely good, and there's not really any moral ambiguity, except for there's certain things where like Boromir dies, or the people getting tempted by the ring and stuff like this. So I guess there's a bit of moral ambiguity, right? But there are some characters who get like tempted, pulled to the dark side and stuff. So there's not completely free of moral ambiguity, but he was more interested in the internal conflicts, or that characters who are more of a gray area and not completely black and white, and a world in which that's because there's more true to what human life is like, and not a kind of a sanitized, sterilized fairy tale kind of thing. And that in some way, when you're doing doing astrology work, is that you're looking at one hand the realistic, grounded world on one hand, and at the other hand looking at these mythic archetypes which are playing out in that world. And so, like I was saying before, in the progressive sense, in the way that we're looking at determinism in a way, people have this idea that it's very limiting to just be born into a peasant family and being told that you don't have anything to work for in life aside from just like fulfilling this task as living out a peasant life. And so people don't like this idea of getting locked into one particular fate or whatever, right? But if you look at what's holding you into living in a peasant life, right? You forget the astrology for a second and just look at it from the other kinds of influences. You have you're born into a family, which is you have a genetic, biological kind of thing where you're conditioned by your culture. There's nature and nurture, right? The nature of your biology and your genes, and the nurture of your family raising you and programming you, and a culture that supports this idea that the only thing that you can do is one thing, right? Or that you can only be a peasant and you can't do anything else with your life, right? And that a fatalistic, deterministic kind of ancient, you're just a peasant, and the Lord who rules over you, if you go anywhere near him, he'll chop your head off. So don't even think about it. The best thing to do is just know your place and not challenge that, right? So that, like, people don't really like that kind of dynamic, and there's something in that about ancient astrology. And if you look at Game of Thrones, and when you listen to George R. R. Martin talk, that's kind of the perspective that he's taking from it, right? So the question about fate, though, is like, if you were an ancient astrologer and you're trying to say, like, I'm reading, the peasant isn't going to have any chance to do anything other than be a peasant, so you don't, and he doesn't have any money anyway, so not reading charts for peasants. So we read for noble people, so we generally only read charts for men, and it's usually about what kind of woman's going to be a good match for the chart, never mind what the woman wants. That's kind of like the world that, like, ancient astrology came out of, right? And it's not like I'm attracted to astrology because I'm attracted to maintaining a super traditional paradigm like this or whatever, or a very deterministic, fated thing where there's no options in life and all this. But it's an interesting problem, running into this problem of running into the edges of what when life starts to feel kind of limiting, right? When you start to run into limits in life, when people start to wonder about spirituality is often when they hit a limit, right? Because there's certain, like, what does it mean to go beyond the limit, right? And does that mean, what is it? It could be like, it's healing in a sense or whatever, because you want to translate that into overcoming the limits in your own life and stuff. And if you want to, or whatever, if you want to look at what is really true, what's actually true, is it true? Like, if somebody's a peasant, is it true that they're a peasant because God wants them to just be a peasant and God doesn't want them to be anything else? Or is it true that there's a peasant because some other asshole has a sword to their neck? Which is this is essentially the problem about Foucault and postmodernism and all this kind of stuff, is that you can look at Game of Thrones in different ways, right? Like, is it God keeping you locked into this position, or is it the just power, right? And this is the tension with Jordan Peterson and all this kind of stuff. But it's a political issue underlying astrology, which is to say that we are fated and that we have a destiny to play out and we have a path to play. That to what extent is this destiny and this path determined by a supernatural force that has our best intentions in mind, and to what extent is it just fairly arbitrary stuff that isn't really divine at all? If it's just certain things like, this is just how the chips fell and who won this petty battle and these bastards battling it out with each other, or even if, okay, if we can say that even the fate that happens, the ups and downs, the wins and the losses, and the involvement in the messy involvement in life, is that maybe we can start to use the moon, and you can start to use the 12 zodiac signs to sort of like understand that kind of who's going to win the battles, right? And who's going to chop each other's heads off, and all this. But it's sort of like, astrologers, if you're trying to market astrology and just be honest about it, is that there is actually, if you're invested in that side of things, then there is actually perhaps some usefulness of astrology, but then it's sort of kind of shady, because it's sort of like, what exactly are you trying to do here exactly, right? But if you try to apply this, I mean, people aren't okay. We're not living in Game of Thrones totally right now, anyways, and it's probably better if we don't live in Game of Thrones. But like I'm trying to say, if you look at like a competitive capitalistic consumer society, that people kind of take this individualistic cutthroat mentality towards whatever. Like I don't feel like we live in a society that has oh well, I don't know, at least my own, I don't know, my the way I'm playing my position here anyways is that I was talking a lot about Melisandre as a character because I mean whatever, I live with my mom and my sister, but aside from that I don't feel like a person who's part of a big family. I feel like it's one of these things where pretty soon it's probably like it's just going to be me, and I don't really have much of a family support. I don't have much of a social support. I don't have this and that. But the one thing that's really supported me in my life has been what has opened up for me in terms of like religion and spirituality and all this kind of stuff. And so in terms of like whatever, the idea of devotion, right? That at some point in time spiritual devotion may seem like a kind of a foreign, like strange alien idea, but then as your life plays out, then it's kind of like at some point in time it feels like it's the most obvious. Like what else are you going to be devoted devoted to, honestly, really? Like where are you going to, do not lay your treasures where moth and flame corrupt, as they, where are you going to what whose boss are you working for anyways? Are you going to work for a boss who's going to get their head chopped off in the next act, or are you going to work for something a bit more stable than that, basically, right? Is the and there's something about the devotional, I don't know, devotional spirituality in that if you're looking at what astrology is for, it's like you can't, the mess is still there, though. The mess is still going on and we have to navigate the mess. But like the point is, like Adam Ellenboss is saying, is that like planets are like grabbers, right? They're like these influences which grab you. And but the thing is, then if you look at like family stuff, like if you're born into a certain family and you have to live your or you're born into a culture that has these really strict cultural rules about how you're supposed to live your life, and you can't live your life outside of that, then that's also like being grabbed, isn't it? Like being grabbed by a really restrictive cultural thing where it's like, is that what God wants for you? Is that, but I mean, if you're really thoroughly conditioned that that's your identity, then maybe that is, maybe it's totally valid. Maybe it actually works out that you're like, oh, I'm born into this thing that is just who I am, and I can do all this stuff, and I'm be myself, and that's great, right? But what if you're not born into that? What if you're somebody else, and that it's not so clear cut that you're just this person who's born into this thing and you fulfill, and it's more of an open game. Then what, right? And it's like the philosoph. This is what I'm going here because it's more in, like, I don't know. There's maybe if I could be making like, the new moon, 12 intentions for the new moon or something. I'd like, or whatever, but I mean, this is more on my mind as an interesting thing to talk about. So this is what you're getting basically. So like, I'm basically, if I'm going to do this, I have to go where the fire is basically. If there's no fire in doing we have to keep the fire burning, and if it's just going to be me doling out like monotonous thing every week and not getting any interaction or any feedback or any whatever, like I'm not going to do it. And so like the thing about doing this Game of Thrones stuff though is that I'm getting a lot more, like my Jupiter in Aries video got a lot more popularity, got a lot more attention than any of my Games of Thrones stuff. But if you pay attention to what I'm doing in my Game of Thrones videos, it's like the two of those work together. That it's kind of like you can't, in some way you can't have the two things without the other. So even if I'm doing videos that don't do as well in terms of the numbers, that the message of the Jupiter and Aries video has more to do with this, like they're whatever. Maybe you can see what I'm saying, maybe you don't. But anyways, one of the things that I wanted to talk about as to continue the last video I made was, or the last couple of videos anyways, was there. Okay, Melisandre had this thing of saying that like she doesn't believe there's any hell aside from the one that we live in or the one that we are creating, right? And so in Game of Thrones, that it's like if there's any relief to the awfulness of Game of Thrones, that, or like there's also that weird thing where Jon Snow dies and they ask him about an afterlife and he's like there's just nothing or whatever, and it's kind of unsettling. And even Melisandre is asking him, right? Because but there's the note that as awful as it is in Game of Thrones, that if there isn't any hell and all that, and but there you've got an army of undead crazy things and dragons and stuff like that in Game of Thrones. Well, it's like there's maybe there's something metaphorical here, but the mythical element of the fantasy underworld or something. I don't know. The point is that that for all the hellish things that go on in Game of Thrones, at least there's no hell if you die. That's like at least a, but that the idea of like, okay, where am I trying to go with this? Creating your own reality. That they say like new age stuff, new thought stuff. You create your own reality, and so there's some sort of tension here with talking about Game of Thrones, because the idea of this typical thing of people being like, don't focus on the negative, don't affirm that the world is hell. You know, you have to affirm that we want to make heaven on earth, not that the world is hell, right? You don't want to affirm that the world is like Game of Thrones. Why would you do that, right? We want to be in the process of creating a nice situation for everybody, right? But the thing is, like, what I'm trying to say is that the idea of intentionally, consciously creating our own reality, and whether or not stuff like Game of Thrones is useful, whether or not stuff like Thomas Ligotti is useful. And I haven't actually read any Thomas Ligotti, but I can talk about like True Detective, the first season of True Detective, which I think they just borrowed this from Ligotti anyways. But there's the idea that God doesn't make the world bad, people do, basically. That the True Detective, to make a transition from Game of Thrones to True Detective, the True Detective is like, like, if you are, like, what am I trying to say? The basic point I want to make is that my problem with a lot of this new age stuff is that, like, or people who are, like, positive psychology people, is that if you live your life in such a way where you live a kind of a privileged and isolated life where you're only focusing on things that make you happy, on what comforts you, and that there could be and only believing in a positive idea of the world where everything is love and light and happiness and stuff like this, is that there could be a lot of people around you who are having very different experiences of the world, and whether or not those are valid or not, it's not like, if it's just a bummer to consider that other people are not having a very good time and you just want to isolate and not consider other people and then retreat in a kind of a thing where you're like, oh, it's like I'm just in touch with the divine reality that's beyond all appearances, and all the people suffering don't actually exist, and all this kind of stuff, is like, because the thing is, that's where the Buddhists came up with this thing of the Bodhisattva vow, that you have some kind of responsibility to actually participate, and not just, if you find that there's a way that you can do that, that it's still probably better to go and help out the other people, so that that they're not completely, just maybe in some perspective there might just be fantasies of Maya or something like that, but it's ultimately, this process is going to convince you that it's probably a good idea that you should go back and be responsible, right? And so that if the suffering in the world that Thomas Ligotti is talking about, that it's not, you can't just say there's an evil God that has made the world evil and that all us innocent people are suffering. When you look at Game of Thrones, most of the suffering is people being jerks to other people being evil to other people, and oftentimes, what is it? Petty power games to to seize a throne that you're going to sit on for a short period of time before you get your head chopped off and somebody else seizes the throne and they get their head chopped, and then this cycle of violence and stuff to compete for power, basically, which is, I'm not the only person who would say it's not a good thing to be too invested in. Um, but I think it's not a waste of time to add my voice to a kind of a chorus, or at least to, if I'm going to put my time and energy into something as a social media influencer, I'm going to try to influence in that direction. You know, that's kind of, I'm going to put my chips in the game on a different thing, right? That's I'm going to put my money on a different horse. Uh, and whether or not we make any progress, it's not a zero sum game. It's more of the drop in the bucket. Um, I'm just looking at some notes I have, but I think I've spoken enough. I think I'll end here. Thanks for listening.